So, greetings. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about monopoly. I'm going to give you a bit of American economic history of how the government has typically thought about monopoly, how that's changed over the past 120 years or so, what the issues are, how they're changing, and then I'm going to apply it to one particular branch of the creative industries, namely the movie business. Okay, because of how monopoly played out there actually had some fairly important cases and a lot of important changes. So that's what we're doing this week, as we're talking about monopoly. Next week, the week after this one, we'll talk about how it applies to big tech social media companies like Facebook and Google and all that. So, but we won't talk about them this week. This week we're just going to talk about monopoly in general. Okay, so a bit of economics, a bit of history. That's where we're headed today. So what does monopoly mean? It's always a matter of degree, but it essentially captures the idea of having market power as a seller. Okay. So you are selling some product, and because of a lack of competition, you have a lot of power to set your own prices, set the terms of trade. I'll differentiate it from monopsony, different word. Monopsony is when you have a lot of market power as a buyer. So suppose you're a company town and you are the main employer, in fact, one of the only employers, you have a lot of power there over workers, right? That's monopsony. But here I'm talking about monopoly, where you're talking about actually selling products, okay? A few more terms to keep in mind. What we call a contestable monopoly is one where you have the only business in town, but in fact, a competitor could easily set up if they wanted to, okay? So suppose I'm in Bloomington and I'm running a Canadian restaurant, okay, where we have lots of Canadian food. And I'm the only Canadian restaurant in town. Now you could say, well, Professor Rushton has a monopoly on Canadian restaurants in Bloomington. And yeah, I would be the only firm, but it would not be hard for another Canadian, say Professor Veronkovich, to come along, and she could decide that she is also going to set up a Canadian themed restaurant. Restaurants do not have a whole bunch of fixed costs in terms of setting up. So I'd have a monopoly, but not with a lot of power, because anybody else could come up and set up a competing business fairly easily. We call that a contestable monopoly, and we don't worry about them too much. I mean, sometimes the market is such that there's really only room for one firm, and we're not going to get too upset if a town only has one Canadian food restaurant, especially if it is possible for a rival to set up, and perhaps a rival who makes better food. I will give a heads up that if you've not yet taken my Y504 class on organizations, one of the things we actually talk about in that class is where you get that sort of market power. If you have sort of the one business, how do you make it difficult for competition to threaten you? So it's kind of funny, in this lecture, I'm talking about why it's a bad thing. In Y504, I actually talk about how you might want to establish it. That's through Michael Porter, but we'll save that for that class. So why do governments in general, and economists in general, not like monopoly? Okay, what's so bad about it? What's the problem? Well, I'd say there are 4 problems. One is we don't like the prices they charge. In general, for economic efficiency, we like prices to be around marginal costs. Okay, that tends to be efficient. And monopolies typically have the market power to be able to price above that. And we don't like that because we think it limits supply, charges prices that are too high. Another topic that you do in another course in Y530 on marketing and audience development, you'll be talking about price discrimination, actually reading the book I wrote in that class. And that actually helps with it because it takes the price to the marginal buyer down closer to marginal cost. But that is one problem. Monopolies charge prices that are too high. We actually talked about that in copyright, that one of the trade-offs on copyright is that copyright essentially gives the author a monopoly right to market their product. That's the whole idea, but it does give you higher prices. Second thing is, second problem with monopoly is we want potential competition because it prevents firms from getting stagnant. Okay, if there's no way that firms can ever compete with the one firm that's already there, that firm can get pretty dull. It can just say, well, we've got market power, we can just keep doing what we've always done, and it shuts out entrepreneurs and it shuts out sort of any innovation. And we want new ideas, we want cool ideas. So that's the second problem with monopolies. One, they charge prices that are too high. Two, they might be stifling innovation. Third problem is that we don't like income inequality. And there's been a lot of evidence that suggested that as our economy has become more monopolized on product markets, it's also tending to be associated with more income inequality. And we think that's just a bad thing on the face of it. And then the final thing, the fourth problem, is that if you do have income inequality, that tends to lead to political inequality. And you don't have to be in the United States very long before you see the influence of big money on politics. And we generally think that's a bad idea. It's anti-democratic in a sense. Okay, so Timothy Wu, whose book you will be reading chapters of that I posted up on Canvas, he calls this the curse of bigness. Okay, and his book is really about the problems of monopoly. And so antitrust, okay, remember that term. Antitrust is the set of laws that we have to limit monopoly power. That's the idea here. Now, Wu's concern, if you read his book, is that sort of since the 1970s, so for about 50 years, the basic philosophy in antitrust has been solely concerned with the immediate impact on consumers and nothing else. And so essentially, a legal philosophy is developed, mostly out of the Chicago school, the sort of law and economics movement, that has said, well, if there's a corporate merger, as long as it doesn't increase prices right away to consumers, it's okay. Okay, so if, say, Microsoft is sort of destroying all competition, but it's keeping things fairly cheap, then, hey, where's the problem, okay? And Wu says, well, it ignores all the other problems. That's the thing. It might, you might say, well, it's not causing an increase in prices, so we're all good. But it ignores all of that political power. It ignores the effect on people being able to innovate, start new businesses, and so on. So why is this body of law called antitrust? Well, what is it? What is it anti? What are trusts? Trusts were monopolies created out of mergers and buyouts. Okay, so what you had was industries all the way back to the 19th century, where you would have rival firms, say in railroads, in coal, in steel manufacture, in shipping, that would merge. Okay, they would merge and create great big firms. And at the turn of the last century, if you go all the way back then, business elites proclaimed them as a force for good, because they said, look, this is going to eliminate the uncertainty that comes from competition, bankruptcies and layoffs and disruptions. You'd have a much more stable economy if you just had all these great big monopolies in steel and banking and oil and railroads and so on. Everything would be stable. Now, the Sherman Act was meant to constrain trusts, right, to sort of hold them back, and that dates from 1890, so going back a long way, but it wasn't really enforced very much. Okay, and so you had these big monopolies develop, and some people got very, very rich, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, all these old families, right? Now, the real change came with the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt in 1901. He aggressively went after them. He was named a trust buster, as did his successor, President Taft, and they started taking cases to the Supreme Court and won. Okay, they had the law on their side. And Roosevelt was somebody who contended that antitrust had a political as well as an economic function. It prevented the consolidation of political power in private industry. Okay, so to take one big example, Standard Oil. Standard Oil was the trust. It was huge. Now Rockefeller, and it was the Rockefellers who got rich through Standard Oil. Rockefeller was an interesting guy. He was very religious. He was very charitable. He was a great patron of the arts and education. You only have to go to Chicago to see the Art Institute of Chicago, to see the University of Chicago, to see some of what Rockefeller provided much of the funding for, very generous that way, but he was absolutely ruthless in business, okay, absolutely. And he monopolized oil refining, okay, that was where he made his money, was in oil refining. And he organized with the railroads to use exclusionary pricing against would-be competitors, okay? So he sort of coordinated with the railroads to eliminate competition from potential competitors in the oil refining business. Wu notes as an aside that laws that were passed to make sure that railroads charged the same prices to everybody to create fairness are much the same as the current day net neutrality debate, ensuring that internet providers do not charge discriminatory prices on different users. And he points out railroads were the network of the turn of the last century. The internet is the network of today, right? Since we're in an information economy. So anyway, the government sued Standard Oil, and in 1911, the Supreme Court proposed the remedy of breaking it up, and they broke it up to 34 parts. Okay, they really did split up that trust. You see fragments still today. So Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, all these different gas companies you see are actually parts of what were Standard Oil. They're all fragments of that. And Wu notes that the parts were actually fairly successful. They did well. In fact, there were some diseconomies of scale. It was not necessarily the case that it worked well to have this great big consolidation, and that companies on their own could be a lot more innovative if they were split up. Okay? And so you can get more innovation if you actually break things up. And so let me take it to the movie business. Okay, so let's look at a history of movies. And here's where you want to read the chapters by Richard Caves. Caves is really good on this stuff. So, a bit of a history of the movies. In the 19-teens, okay, so we're going to go back about 100 years. That's when the feature-length film became the primary product of the movie studios. Okay, so a movie that's about sort of an hour and a half long, with recognizable movie stars in the lead role and so on. It's actually an old art form that we're looking at. It's essentially feature films we see now have the same kind of basic setup as feature films from 100 years ago. Your big six studios were ones that you actually still see around right now. MGM, Paramount, 20th Century Fox, United Artists, Warner Brothers. These are really familiar names. So these are firms that have been around for a long time. Point out in a few minutes. What they do is different now, but that's what they did. Now, these firms all had what is called vertical integration. Vertical integration means essentially where you produce your output, you produce the inputs that go into that output, and you do the marketing and retail of it. Okay, so everything from, imagine a farm-to-table restaurant, right? That is vertical integration. You grow the food, you prepare it, you cook it, you serve it to customers, right? That is a simple example of vertical integration, but the movie business was like that. So the movie studios had all these employees. They would employ actors and writers and directors and set designers and everything like that. They all worked in these big studios. In fact, that's why they're called studios. And quite famously, you'd have these big studio lots and so on. It was a real assembly line kind of production. It was very, very efficient. Okay, the movie studios were really, really good at producing sort of a standardized product. Because you had all these employees and you could make sure they were always fully employed, always working on schedule, managing all the resources. And so they became very, very good, very, very efficient at producing kind of a standardized product. And as wonderful as the old studio system movies are, if you watch Turner Classic Movies from the 30s and 40s, great stuff to watch, but you will notice that there's a similarity across all the movies, right? There's a bit of a sameness to them, even when you have really witty writing and really superb acting and so on. There's not a ton of innovation there. Any innovation was fairly cautious. Now, your big trust problem here was that the movie studios owned the cinemas where movies were shown, okay? And so, say Warner Brothers not only made movies, but it also, in major markets, actually owned the cinemas that would show the Warner Brothers movies. Now, the studios wanted this because they said, look, we're producing all this output on a continuous basis. We need a place to show it. So we want to have our own cinemas to be able to do that. Well, This created problems because suppose you wanted to independently start making movies. Well, you're going to have a tough time because where are you going to show these, right? So if I try to make a movie on my own outside of that studio system, where am I going to show them? Because the major studios own the cinemas. Or take the other side of the market. Suppose I'm in a small town and I own a little cinema, okay? And I want to be able to show movies there, okay, in the cinema that I own. Where am I going to get the movies from? Okay, how am I going to get them? And in fact, it was pretty tough. They did exist, independent cinemas did exist, but if you wanted a chance for a first run movie, right, the new hit, you had to commit early, okay? If you were a so-called second run movie theater where you show things sort of a couple of months after they first come out, you had to do so-called block booking, which meant that you had to essentially buy a package of movies from a studio without even having seen them. Okay, so it was pretty tough. It was pretty tough. And so you started to get complaints through the 1930s that this was bad. So that time, the president was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he looked at this and he said, yeah, this is a problem, but I'm going to cut the studios a break here because, you know, Great Depression and all that. But after that, and getting into the 1940s, you got a compromise between the studios and the Department of Justice, where they tried to see, you know, how can we eventually, you know, sort of change this. But the movie studios kept a lot of their power. And then finally, in 1947, we had the so-called Paramount Decree. And you'll see I've got a bunch of readings on the syllabus about the Paramount decision. And the Paramount decision was essentially movie studios, you have to get rid of the cinemas. Okay? You can't own them anymore. Now, the studios weren't that upset. Because in the late 1940s, they turned their attention to where they thought there was going to be the really big money, which was television, which was just getting started. And antitrust would have surely prevented them from getting into TV. And so they came to an agreement and they said, okay, one, we're no longer going to do block booking with independent cinemas, and two, we're going to sell off our cinemas, okay? We're not going to own them at all. So that was the Paramount Decree. And that was why up to this day, you do not, when you go out to the movies, you are not going to a cinema owned by 20th Century Fox or Paramount or Warner Brothers, all right? So how do things work now? Well, since the studios no longer had an incentive for this sort of steady assembly line flow of movies to fill the theaters, they actually got out of the production business. And so movie studios don't actually make movies anymore. Their main job is they will maybe co-finance really big budget films, okay, that need, say, over, you know, $100 million or so. They'll co-finance that, though it's always only co-financing with a separate production company, or they will pick up independent movies. And independent movies are ones that are independently financed, and then studios will pick them up and distribute them through their network. So all of the major studios have branches to pick up independent movies, okay? So 20th Century Fox has Fox Searchlight, okay? So if you're ever watching a movie and you see Fox Searchlight, that means it was made independently, but then Fox picked it up and distributed it. Or if you see a movie from Focus, okay, another one, that means that it was made independently and Universal Studios picked it up and distributed it, okay? So they all have these independent branches. Film production itself is now independent and project-based, okay? So when a movie is made, essentially a production company decides to do a film, and it hires everybody for sort of a one-term project. So hire a director, hire the writers, hire the main actors, and then, you know, go all the way down the long list of credits that you see. Other people often help in that. They make that movie, and the producers make sure it gets onto a distribution company. But all of the people who worked on the movie, when that project is done, they go off to do another project. Okay, it's over. So everything in the movie business now is project-based. It is not really made by sort of continuous firms. Okay, and then film distribution with the cinemas is a highly complex box office sharing formula between distributors and cinemas. Okay, so that's how that works. Now, Wu's point, okay, Timothy Wu's point on the curse of Bigness is he says, you know what? When that happened, when you sort of broke up the studios when movie production became this independent thing, when it got out of these big firms. Movie making became a lot more innovative. Okay, you wanted innovation now to bring people into theaters. They had to compete with television now, so that competition also spurred more innovation in movies. Because it was more project-based, you had the innovation of different actors and directors and writers coming together and sharing ideas. And so especially through the 60s and 70s, as the studios completely got out of the business and independent production came up, you had tremendous innovation in what kind of movies were out there. The early 70s especially is one of my favorite periods in movies, where you just had so much going on and so much innovative cinema that was happening there. Okay, so what's going on now? Well, just last fall, and it was funny, I was teaching this very material in this very course last fall when all of these events started happening. The Department of Justice says, you know, do we really need this Paramount degree anymore? Does it really matter? Because it's kind of dated. And it's become dated because of technology, because look at what you have now. Since we are all at home, watching movies at home, because who wants to go to a cinema these days? What do we watch? Well, we watch Amazon Prime, and we see all these movies essentially produced and distributed by Amazon. We turn to Netflix, and we see Netflix originals. And so what are we watching? Well, we are watching companies that are both producing films and distributing them, right? Which is kind of exactly what the Paramount degree was meant to get around. So technology and streaming of movies is kind of, well, this is what we used to see. And the major studios are saying, look, you know, these guys have all kinds of advantages. Maybe we should be allowed to buy cinemas. In fact, Amazon is looking at buying cinemas, last I looked. And so there seems to be a call for more flexibility in who can actually own cinemas and show movies. Now, I don't know what's going to happen after the pandemic is done. It seems to me that one of the most vulnerable industries is the movie cinema business, right? Live theater, we still like to go see live actors, right? So, you know, live theater has always been a kind of a shoestring business, tough to keep things afloat, but you are offering something very unique, right? The chance to see live actors, same with, live music and dance. But films are different, because we're getting very used to watching movies that are screened. We have a tremendous variety of films that we can now watch in the comfort of our home. And technology has meant that, as students, you might not have this, but, a lot of homes have, great big screens, super sound systems. And so the demand for actually going out to see movies in cinemas might be permanently changed through this pandemic. We'll see. Notice that of the 40,000 cinema screens in the US, which is bound to decline with the pandemic, half of them are owned by just 3 companies. And so you do get kind of a trust there. But AMC, which is the big company here in Bloomington, Regal, and Cinemark own a lot. So there is a lot of concentration there. Now, the return of block booking with small cinemas would be bad, because they would still have to, they would have trouble getting big films. So we'll have to see. But in a world of Amazon Prime, Netflix, and now Disney Plus as well, to take another major studio, we're going to have to see what happens. Okay, so you kind of get the sense that even though they're relaxing the Paramount decree, it's not really clear to me that studios are going to want to own cinema chains anyway. It's not exactly a growth business. Okay, so what I've given you here is a bit of a history on how the US government in particular has looked at trusts, monopolies, and one example from the cultural sector, namely movies. What we'll do next week is we're going to go back to what we talked about last week, namely social media. Because with the major social media companies, Amazon, Facebook, and Google, you are starting to get this kind of concentration again, and in particular, ownership of multiple entities. And so we're going to ask the question, well, are these trusts that need to be broken up as well? We'll talk about that next time.